Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for everyone for joining today. This is actually the second of our quarters webinar sessions. We'll be doing many more of these going forward. So if you are interested in taking part or joining the next sessions, do keep up to date via our social channels. Few bit of pieces of housekeeping before we get started. So these sessions we do typically run to coincide actually with the release of our city level quarterly reports. So those reports will actually be released in the coming days. So again, do keep an eye out for those. We're also recording today's session. So for everybody that's joining now, we'll make sure that a copy of that recording does get sent out in the coming days. And then finally as well, there's an opportunity to ask questions. So if you do have any questions, you should be able to find the Q&A button on Zoom. So do feel free to submit those, and we'll try and get through as many as we can afterwards, just conscious of time, so we may not get through all of them, but do again submit those questions if you have them. Lastly, really pleased to announce that we've got Ben from UCAS joining today, as well as Richard from Kexgill. So I think before we get started, it'll be good just to have a 30-second intro from the panelists that we have today, and then we'll come back to them after the initial data presentation, and then we'll go through some Q&As with Ben and Richard as well. So Ben, starting with you, do you mind just giving a quick introduction? That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Richard. So my name is Ben Jordan. I'm the head of policy here at UCAS. Essentially, I'm responsible for three things. It's our understanding of the external landscape and what that means for us and what we think about that. Secondly, I oversee our research pipeline, and we've made a real step change in our thought leadership over the last 2 years. And the third thing I look after is our strategy for supporting disadvantaged students.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I'm Richard Stott, the MD of the Kexgill Group. We've rebranded in the UK as the University Quarter. We're also in Germany, and we're a wholly private company with no internal investment other than ourselves. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much. So yeah, really looking forward to what both of you have to say shortly. So on that, let's get started. So in terms of the topics that I'm going to be covering today, we'll have a look at the most recent search behaviour and look at the various trends that we're seeing there. We'll then touch on the latest PBSA occupancy specifically, before moving on to updates to the supply pipeline. We'll then have a look at PBSA provision and how that's potentially changing going forward. And then we'll have the presentations from Ben and Richard before moving on to the Q&As at the very end. So let's start by looking at how search behaviour has changed quarter on quarter. So starting with this particular slide, what we have here on the right-hand side is data collected from actively house hunting students. So when they are searching on the platform, what are they specifically searching for in terms of unit size, i.e. are they after a studio bed or do they want 4 bedrooms? Now, what the chart on the right depicts is how that has changed quarter on quarter. Now, if we look at the Q1 numbers, and that actually refers to the October to December period last year, which is the first quarter of the new letting cycle, we can see that demand was really skewed towards larger sizes, so 4, 5 and 6 beds specifically. Now, that is predominantly driven by UK demand, with domestic students typically looking for clusters or HMOs. And actually looking at the numbers, we can see that those 4 sizes, so 4, 5 and 6 beds, equated to about 67% of searches performed. So a really significant proportion. Moving forward to Q2, which is January to March just past, we can see how that demand starts to shift. So for example, those larger sizes were capturing about 44%. So relatively large reduction there. And we can see more interest starting to build for studios, 1 beds and 2 beds. Now, that is a seasonal trend that we would entirely expect. And actually, that's something we see pretty much every year, so it's not unexpected. In terms of numbers for those smaller sizes, so if we look at studios, 1 beds, 2 beds, then this quarter, they captured about 38% of demand, and that's up from about 20% in the first quarter, or October, December last year. Again, we would expect that, so nothing unusual there. Moving on to seasonality, and this is something that we've picked up on previous sessions. Predominantly when we've done this, we've actually looked at the seasonality between accommodation types, so HMO and PBSA. This time, we just wanted to look at that data, but using a different data set. And what we've done here on the right is looked at searches being performed by either UK students or students from Asia. Now, what you can clearly see is the difference in seasonality between those demographics. So quite clearly, if we start with the UK students, depicted by the orange line in this case, we can see that decent proportion of demand in October, peaks in November, and then somewhat trails away throughout the rest of the season. Again, entirely what we would expect to see. Now, in terms of East Asian demand, it's essentially the reverse of that. So whilst there are searches taking place early on in the season, it normally builds throughout the course of the cycle, really picking up kind of in the summer months later in the year. Now, what I think is going to be very interesting to see is actually how these trends change going forward. So will we start to see, particularly in markets that are perhaps tight from a supply standpoint, will we see these curves essentially move forward? So we'll see more demand early on. And I suspect that could be the case. And we'll touch on that, particularly in somewhere like Glasgow, which we'll see a bit later in the presentation. For operators, obviously having an understanding of when demand is peaking or perhaps declining due to seasonality is obviously going to be really important for aligning marketing strategies. This particular slide, we actually presented something similar at the recent LD Student Housing Conference. We wanted to show that it's the same data really, but updated to take into account the most recent information that we have. And what we're actually looking at here is specifically searches made by UK students. And we're looking at the difference in both accommodation types as well as price points. So if we look at the chart on the right-hand side, the orange area is demand or listing views specifically for HMOs and at what price points. And the grey area is the same, but for PBSA. So we can start to understand the price points that students are searching for, as well as the accommodation types. Now, what is very clear from that straight away is that most UK students are actually viewing HMO properties. Second and third year domestic, particularly, are going to be, for the most part, and that's what's showing the data here, looking for, searching for, and inquiring for HMO accommodation. And that equated to about 70% of views for the October to April period. In terms of price points, we've adjusted this to take into account the cost of bills, which we'll explore in a bit more detail shortly. But we can see, inclusive of bills, average HMO viewed price of £149, so basically 150 roughly. For PBSA, we can see that that's a particular accommodation type took the balance, so about 23% of searches, and a higher price point, which we probably expect, £166. That's share distribution is actually not too dissimilar to what we saw last year, so it has fluctuated through the course of the letting cycle, which is interesting to note. But we haven't seen a huge shift away from HMOs and more students, domestic at least, looking or searching for PBSA. Looking at the same data this time, but specifically from students searching from East Asia, and some kind of surprising points here, starting with the accommodation preferences. Now, what we can see from the data is that, yes, most East Asian students are in fact viewing and searching for PBSA, but actually there's a substantial amount that have actually looked for HMO accommodation, which in itself is quite interesting. Now, I think one of the reasons for that is that what we have actually seen in the data is that we do see a decent proportion of searches by this demographic actually occurring in October. Now, in October, the majority, probably fair to say, of PBSA operators haven't released their pricing. So East Asian students searching in October will only see HMOs for the most part. And I think that is going to be a contributing factor here. As we progress through the season, we would expect that demand to shift more strongly to PBSA, given that is predominantly the preferred route for East Asian students. So again, that's something we'll keep a close eye on. In terms of price points, again, a big difference to what we just saw with UK students. So average HMO listing view of £170 so far this year, PBSA over £200. And that's outside of London. So if we include London, that will obviously increase further. So some pretty strong numbers there in terms of the price points that are being viewed by that particular demographic. Year on year for PBSA specifically, that listing view price has jumped by over 6%. So not too dissimilar from the rental growth numbers that the likes of Empiric and Unite have recently reported. We would probably expect that number to actually rise as we go throughout the season. And again, we'll see this shortly, but typically you'll have higher price points being viewed as we progress through the letting cycle. So on that point specifically, we've looked at this data just for UK students. We could do it for many different types of demographics, but essentially we wanted to look at that price point distribution, but over a time series. Now, again, this specifically is for UK students, and the chart on the right shows over time what price points are UK students looking at, either for HMOs or for PBSA, and we can see how that has essentially developed. Now, the first thing to note is the narrowing in that spread. So we can see that as of October this year, or sorry, last year, when the new cycle started, that spread narrowed quite considerably. And that is predominantly going to be driven by rising utility costs. And obviously, domestic students particularly exposed to that in the HMO market. In terms of other trends that we can kind of unpick from this, so what we can actually see is that those UK students moving early in the HMO market saw a slight peak there in terms of the price point. So in October 2022, we're looking at listing view price essentially peaking at over £150 a week, inclusive of bills. Quite interesting, and that could actually be a result of early moving students wanting the best accommodation and paying up for it. And then we saw a bit of a drop off after that. In the PBSA market, interesting to note that continued upward trend there. Going to be various contributing factors to that, such as less supply being available as the season progresses, and also possibly some dynamic pricing from operators as well. Moving on to occupancy, just really to recap in case there's anyone on the call that's not familiar. So we actually do work with a large proportion of the market to collect city level occupancy data, and that's what we'll go through now. If anyone's interested in taking part in this, do reach out afterwards and we can obviously have a discussion. And again, a lot of operators are already taking part in that. We wanted to focus again on Glasgow and Coventry, two cities with very contrasting occupancy levels, particularly for this year. So if we start with Glasgow on the left-hand side, what this is essentially depicting is occupancy, booking velocity, depending on how you want to call it, over time, either for clusters or for studios. So if we look at the data for last year, which is represented by the two blue lines, we can see that how the market progressed, and then by the end of September, essentially the end of the letting cycle, pretty much everything was sold out. Now, Glasgow has definitely been one of the markets that saw a arguably over-recruitment during COVID, and that's really now playing out in the numbers. So we can see that for Glasgow this year, that booking velocity has jumped significantly. And as of March this year, we're looking at over 90% booked for both clusters and studios. I think it's pretty fair to say that market is going to sell out pretty quickly if it hasn't already, to be honest. In contrast to that, if we look at Coventry on the right-hand side, we can see that is a market that was much slower last year. And actually, even by September, particularly clusters, there was still a decent number of those still available. So a lot less positive from a operator standpoint. Somewhat positively, it has improved this year, but really only marginally, nowhere near the levels that we have seen in somewhere like Glasgow. Again, going to be various contributing factors to that, but Coventry is a market that has seen a significant amount of supply delivered in a relatively short time frame. It's also a market that has seen declining domestic numbers specifically, and again, those are going to be playing a part in that. As always, though, there's a lot more devil in the detail, and actually occupancy at an individual scheme level is clearly going to vary. So again, this is giving us a good understanding at a city level, but each individual scheme performance will of course vary. In terms of listing views specifically for PBSA, and again, the price point, so similar to what we looked at a few moments ago from UK students, we wanted just to pick out, again, Glasgow and Coventry, just to see how that aligns with that booking velocity data. So this is looking at, of all the views made by all demographics for PBSA, either in Coventry or Glasgow, what were the price points that are being viewed? Now we can see there is somewhat of a correlation there, and actually for Glasgow, we can see that that listing view price again has been steadily rising. Again, that's going to be contributed to dwindling stock that's still available, as well as potentially some dynamic pricing involved. Whereas for Coventry, it's a lot less positive, not much growth there, albeit it does fluctuate. But again, that's tying in with what we've seen with the occupancy data. Moving on, just to give some updates on the supply pipeline. So continuing what we've provided before in these sessions, the chart on the right is depicting over a relatively long time series the number of applications from a bed standpoint, either submitted or approved, and in the 12-month rolling figure. So what we can still see is that as of today, we are still at relatively low levels, historically speaking, compared to, say, 2016, 2017. In terms of the first 3 months of this year, we've seen just shy of 5,500 beds put forward, and that is down by a third, essentially year on year, and also by almost 40% compared to the previous quarter. In terms of the number of beds approved, so we're looking at over 4,000, again, year on year, down by 35%. Somewhat more positively up compared to the previous quarter. Just to pick out a few individual applications, either those that have been submitted or approved. There are obviously many more than this. We track monthly planning application developments across over 40 locations nationally. So we're just picking out a few here. We can see, Manchester, a relatively large scheme being submitted, same in Brighton, and Exeter and Bristol. In terms of those that are being approved, again, schemes in Manchester, a few schemes in Birmingham, and in York in this case as well. Again, that list is much more comprehensive. We're just picking out a few of the notable developments there. In terms of overall pipeline at a national level, so we're currently looking at about 114,000 beds either submitted or approved. Interestingly, about 40% of those are studios. So a significant portion of the beds that are being put forward, again, on studio accommodation, and that's really going to be chasing that international demand pool. In terms of the pipeline per location, again, we've just picked out a handful of locations on the right-hand side, but we can see the number of beds in the pipeline across those specific locations. London does have the largest pipeline, as you'd probably expect, but as a percentage of current supply, it is relatively low. Nottingham, Leeds, both have significant pipelines, and actually those two cities have the largest pipelines outside of London. In terms of how we've seen those pipelines develop quarter on quarter, Bristol, for example, its pipeline grew by 14% quarter on quarter. Exeter, albeit from a relatively low base, but jumped by 23% quarter on quarter. Exeter particularly, I think there's a couple of very large applications that got submitted, which is going to be driving that. Now, what does this mean from a supply growth perspective? So what we really have seen since 2019 really is a slowdown in the number of new beds coming to market. And that's really correlated back to the previous chart where you saw the number of applications being submitted or approved also falling. And that's, again, flowing through into the number of beds being delivered. For this year, the numbers are yet to be finalised, but we're looking at the moment at least, about 11,000 confirmed for 2023. Again, that's going to fluctuate before the end of the year. If we compare that to 2019, when it was close to 37,000 beds, we can really start to appreciate this slowdown in the delivery of new PBSA stock. Most of that new stock that's being delivered is going to have to be relatively highly priced due to build costs, land costs, etc. So actually the proportion of affordable accommodation that's being delivered is even lower. Obviously, that's clearly going to be an issue, particularly for domestic students. On top of that, it gets commented quite regularly in the markets. HMO growth is going to be, again, somewhat limited due to Article 4s and other things as well. So overall, from a national standpoint, supply growth really not keeping a pace with demand growth, but that will vary per location. Now, that's going to impact the provision of PBSA. Now, essentially that slowdown in the delivery of new stock is then flowing through to the provision of PBSA. And what this is essentially showing on the right-hand side is of all students that require a bed nationally, how many could live in PBSA if they chose to do so. It ignores the HMO market, which has a significant role to play. So that's something that's worth bearing in mind. But it gives us an idea of that supply versus demand growth, at least from a PBSA perspective. And we can quite clearly see there, if demand continues to rise, I know Ben will obviously cover this in his slides, and supply continues to slow or not grow as fast as it perhaps should do, then the proportion or provision is looking likely to go down. And that's going to be potentially detrimental to students. What it also means is that there's going to be continued reliance on HMOs because, again, supply growth is not keeping up with demand growth. Just a few final slides to show how that differs between locations. So in this particular slide, we picked out Liverpool and Bath. Liverpool does have a, I'd say arguably a mature PBSA market relative to some other locations. And we can see that PBSA provision is comparatively high, albeit it could actually decline. In Bath, it's relatively low, and it looks like it's going to set or decline from here as well. So interesting trends there to see as well from a provision standpoint. Finally, just to pick up on demand growth and really, again, just highlighting the point that each market is very different. So whilst nationally trends are useful and interesting, again, the devil is in the detail. This slide, we've picked out 3 universities that over that reported time frame of 2019 to 2021 have all shown positive growth in international students, which from a PBSA standpoint is what most will be looking for. Now, when you dive into the detail, you can start to understand it's actually not as clear cut as that. So if we take somewhere like Sheffield Hallam or University of Leicester, both of those universities have actually reported a decline in Chinese numbers, which is going to be critical for the PBSA market. But what they have seen is pretty strong growth in Indian students and Nigeria as well for Sheffield. Those demographics, you have very different demand profiles, both in terms of accommodation preferences, price sensitivity, unit mix, and therefore those markets in terms of the demand profile are changing and not necessarily positively from a particularly high-end PBSA standpoint. The reverse of that, if we look at somewhere like Southampton, that's had a bit of a rebound in Chinese numbers, and that's going to be positive from a, again, PBSA demand perspective. So just to summarize quickly before I hand over to Ben, so really, again, looking at the very start of the presentation, we would expect demand to continue to shift to those smaller sizes as we progress through the season. But again, that's very much aligned with what we would expect. Listing view prices are expected to continue to rise, particularly in those markets that have tight supply and demand fundamentals. And that's going to also flow through into booking velocity, which again, we've touched on. Nationally, that supply growth number is nowhere near where it needs to be from a demand growth perspective. But again, really it's understanding local markets and how those are changing and understanding product fit, how the demographics are changing, supply growth, and so on, are critical for understanding whether a particular scheme can be successful or not. So for me, that's it for today. And what I'd love to do now is to hand over to Ben. And yeah, really looking forward to his slides as well.
Thank you very much, Richard. So yes, as I said, my name's Ben Jordan. I'm the head of policy here at UCAS, and hopefully you'd have picked up and heard about our Journey to a Million campaign. Because on the face of it, it's a relatively simple concept. We're projecting that come 2030, there could be 1 million higher education applicants within a single cycle, which is double the number we saw in 2006, but also 250,000 up from where we are today. But that has a wide range of implications that need consideration. And one of the key questions that I always get asked, it's usually the first hand that goes up, is, well, where will they all live? What about the accommodation consideration? Which is why I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. Normally, if this was an in-person conference, I would say I have some colleagues here. Please make yourself known. But obviously, being in a webinar, we can't raise hands. So my colleague Ollie Wells is in the audience as well. I'm sure he'd be happy to share his email in the chat, but he is our accommodation lead. So do sort of drop him a line. But for many of you, UCAS will be the shared admission service. You will have applied to university via UCAS, and that will be your understanding of us. But we are so much more than that. We are the sort of the go-to place for insight in relation to student progression, ranging from that initial point of discovery and choice all the way through to that student experience. And that includes accommodation as well. And that allows us to have a real deep understanding into the student's mentality as well, and the hearts and minds element, as well as the data points. But if we look back in terms of the cycle, so as I said, in 2006, we had around 500,000 applicants to higher education. And from 2006 to present day, we've had a relatively slow growth. We've had peaks and troughs. You'll be able to see that decline in 2012. But relatively speaking, it's been a gentle growth during that period. But we've also seen that the sector in itself transform during that period. We've seen the introduction of widening participation. Some of you may remember the case of Laura Spence, but that gap in relation to participation has remained stubborn. And there is still inequality of access to some higher education institutions. But a lot of the sector, whilst we've seen a growing number of applicants and increasing demand, has been shaped by that declining 18-year-old population. And in 2012, we had a real shift in the higher education sector, where we had removal of number controls and funding changes and fee increases, for example, that really started to develop and mature the higher education market as it is known today. But with that, you also got market forces. So you started to see behaviors like unconditional offers, and you started to see marketing take a much more prominent position in the HE sector. But within that as well, we've also seen the mass globalization of higher education. So China is now the third biggest market for UK HE. You have England, you have Scotland, you have China, you have Wales, and then you have Northern Ireland. And 2 in 9 international students accepted to UK HE are from China, which presents in itself a number of opportunities and challenges as well, with the sector being increasingly asked to diversify to ensure that they're not exposed to potential risks in that area. But generally speaking, over that period, we've had a growing maturity in the higher education market, and we've had slow and steady growth. And that market in itself is already within a global market. So back in the year 2000, we had about 1.6 internationally mobile students across the globe, and that skyrocketed to 5.6 in 2020. And as part of the journey to 1 million, one of the things that we factor in is that come 2030, we could have 9 million internationally mobile students across the globe. So 9 million individuals studying in a different country to their home nation. But we've also seen significant variance in terms of regional participation. Widening participation, leveling up, social mobility, etc., whatever you want to call it, key area of interest for higher education and the HE sector, and it's a key part of the admissions and recruitment function. But if we go back to 2012 and start looking through that leveling up lens, and this is, I think, of real interest to the accommodation sector, broadly speaking, you see London slightly ahead in terms of their entry rate. So that those percentages are the proportion of the 18-year-old population that enter higher education and from those regions. Broadly speaking, relatively consistent. But if you fast forward to 2022, what you see is growth across all regions, but different levels of growth, particularly in London. So over half of 18-year-olds in London progress to higher education. And interestingly, the gap between London and the second place region is the same as the gap between the second place region and the bottom place region as well. So we're seeing increasing regional disparity in terms of progression to HE. And I couldn't really talk about accommodation and sort of the state of the sector without talking about cost of living. Now, there's been a huge amount of narrative in relation to cost of living, but I just wanted to pick out 2 or 3 things that we see. So firstly, students' expectations of what higher education will be like is starting to be shaped by cost of living. People are thinking about, do I need a part-time job when I'm there? Will I be less social when I'm there? Will I shop in a different supermarket, for example? But the other thing we're seeing is that students want constant reassurance about the financial realities of HE. In the same way as during the pandemic, they wanted constant reassurance about what a COVID secure campus would be like. They're really keen to have that constant financial reassurance. And that is something that I think will resonate with you all. And when thinking about your engagement with students, that is a key area of interest. They are becoming more financially alert and more financially sensitive, but they are looking at making sure they understand all of the support that might be available. So that was a very, very brief history lesson. So if we look forward in terms of the journey to 1 million, as I said, over the last sort of 15 years or so, we've seen a relatively slow and steady growth. But actually, from this point on to the end of the decade, we're projecting that we'll see the same level of growth. So 250,000 from 2006 to present day, and then 250,000 from now until the end of the decade. So that's a really rapid uptick in terms of future demand for higher education. But that demand is happening today. It's very easy to talk about 1 million applicants in 2030, but actually we don't just hit 2030 and suddenly they all appear. Actually, we're seeing year on year increases in the size of the overall population, and therefore the group of students that may wish to access higher education. And when we look at what's really driving that, it's largely the 18-year-old population. There is a population boom in relation to that audience. If you cast your mind back 10, 12 years, for example, you may remember basically News at 10 every day would talk about there's not enough primary school places. What can we do with this population boom and these young people? It's that group of students progressing through to higher education. And ONS data suggests that come 2030, there'll be 900,000 18-year-olds in the population. So we're projecting increased demand from the 18-year-old cohort and numerically more 18-year-olds. We're also expecting to see continued demand from international students. Now, you'll recall I said at the start that China is the third biggest market for UK higher education. Come 2030, it could overtake Scotland and be the second biggest market for UK HE. In terms of mature students, they're a very, very hard group to forecast and project due to how influenced they are by the economy. And, you know, those students tend to be influenced either by downturns in the economy where they seek to enter higher education, or when there's an upturn in the economy, they tend not to. We have a slightly odd economic situation at the moment where there's uncertainty around the economy, but a high number of job vacancies out there, which is making it a very hard time to project the future demand from that group. But with all projections, there are always going to be disruptors along the pipeline. So if you think about the fact we have a general election in the next 2 years, for example, that could bring with it significant policy change in terms of higher education. We could see significant geopolitical shifts, as we've seen as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's turned off a pipeline of students almost overnight. But what we've done is we've modeled all of these different disruptors. And even in those events where all of these significant events happen on the same day, we still see growth. So we're really confident that due to the strength of the growth of the 18-year-old population and how that drives demand for HE, that even with all of those disruptors, we'll still see growth. But we could actually see that growth accelerated in some of those instances. So if the UK's market share increases for international students, for example, or if the economic conditions make higher education more attractive to more mature students, we could be talking about 1.1 million applicants in 2030. Now, this in itself presents a range of opportunities and challenges in relation to higher education. The accommodation one is a really, really obvious one, as I said, because more applicants means more students. And I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone in this room that you can't just build accommodation overnight. It takes planning, it takes engagement, etc. Which is why we're making these noises now about the increasing demand for higher education, because we still have time to do something about it. But ultimately, what the Journey to 1 Million creates is a much more competitive environment. It's as unlikely that opportunities available in higher education will be met by the market. So it's unlikely that we'll see an expansion in places that the market would dictate. So it's likely that some students are going to have to think differently about those choices and consider options that they may not have thought about. So that might be different universities, for example, or different courses or different routes. But it also might mean more students exploring an apprenticeship option. And at the moment, we know around 400,000 students are interested in apprenticeship options alongside their undergraduate choices. We think that could increase to over 500,000 as a result of the Journey to 1 Million. So not only do we see this increasing demand, but that comes with increasing competition, and that might mean some students think differently about their choices. But we'll also see changes in behavior in relation to university recruitment strategies. We might see different and higher entry requirements at some universities. We might see different offer making strategies, and that ultimately might start to influence the shape of clearing as well. Now, what are we doing about this? So, like I said, I'm really hoping that you've seen some of our Journey to a Million campaign, and we've partnered with United Knight Frank in the production of this. But what we've done, we've launched an essay collection where we've asked a range of sector leaders, what does the Journey to a Million mean for you? And all of these are available on ucas.com/J2AM. And like I said, we explore the full range of impacts across the student journey, all the way from that point of, I'm starting to think about my options, what should I do, to I'm in that choice, so what is my student experience like, and how is that influenced by the Journey to a Million, to the accommodation side, the specific essays on that, to graduate employability, because as I said, more applicants means more students, which means more graduates. And ultimately, the Journey to a Million in itself isn't an educational problem, it's an economic problem. So like I said, all of the essays are there. I think one of the key messages that we're looking to land is that the Journey to a Million, whilst we see an increase in applicants, we don't want to see an increase in disappointed applicants and therefore wasted talent, which is why we're launching this campaign, and we'll continue to deliver this campaign over the next couple of years to raise awareness of this increase in demand for higher education and all of the pinch points across the education sector. As I said, the essays can be found on ucas.com/J2AM. I'm available on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I'm happy to share my email address as well. But really interested in any thoughts or comments about what this means for the accommodation sector and how UCAS can work with you to help improve the experience for students in this place.
Thanks, Ben. Really interesting stuff. Particularly like the difference in participation between regions. Quite interesting. See how far London's really kind of pulled ahead from everywhere else, which in itself is interesting. So I really appreciate that. Richard, over to you. Really kind of pleased to have you on today's call and kind of keen to get your thoughts. So over to you, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time left for a few Q&As as well.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Ben. That was fascinating. Clearly, it's an evolving market at the moment. We all know there's been a huge, as we saw from Richard's presentation, a huge growth in international postgraduates. And the recent changes, you can't bring your dependents. That's not going to impact on the PBSA sector at all. Limited impact on the HMO sector, but it will impact on lower tier universities. That's less income. So that is something that is the health of the universities you've got to look at. And there is a requirement. There's always a requirement for affordable accommodation. Have we done a great deal about it? Nope. It's so difficult, and really the conversations need to happen between local authorities, between universities and us. And I'm not seeing it. The government needs to look at this, because this is a big business. And there is a perceived reduction in HMO provision. It's not the same everywhere. Each location is different. And I'm not even going to touch on the Renters Reform Act, because the devil, as Richard's been saying, is in the detail, and we don't know the detail yet. It could be pretty unpleasant, and it could be, okay, I can see that the reason for that, but the devil is in the detail and it's not out there yet. Very briefly, our activity over the last few years, it's been conversions, bespoke conversions from offices to student accommodation, and refurbishment of tired PBSA. For us, a sweet spot is 50 to 200 beds. Where we have existing infrastructure, and we develop them to keep them. But you really don't want to hear about me. So next slide, please, Richard. Life outside the Russell Group. I can say lots of things here. We're in 9 locations, and it's all massive generalizations, because each location is absolutely different. Where there's more risk, there's a better yield. We all pretty much know that. To give you a guide, across our group, if you averaged our yields against current valuations, we show a gross yield of 10.5%. In some locations, the odd one or two here are showing 16%. our PBSA is lower, and you would expect that. You would expect a higher yield in HMOs than you would get in PBSA. It doesn't always work like that. Then, obviously, if you're an institution, if you're investing in PBSA for the first time, you'd prefer a location with at least 2 universities. And I absolutely get that. Some things I don't understand. For example, if you have 2 universities in one city and one university is on the outskirts and the other one's in the city centre, I have seen PBSA crop up and it says we're equidistant from the one on the outskirts and the one in the middle. And it's okay, there are buses and trams. I don't get that, really, long term, but what do I know? We've always said, and we've said for the many years we've been about, really, a student needs to fall out of bed and then be in a lecture theatre. And to me, disregarding some cities, I mean, London, that's not going to happen. But that's pretty much our mantra. And that's always, everyone keeps saying, you know, location, location, location. It is really. And it's always will be. There are more HMOs outside the Russell Group. It's just generally speaking, apart from Coventry, which seems to be a wash. Everybody seems to be there. And outside the Russell Group, you've got a reduced reliance on high income internationals, where I'm saying that most of us are saying, well, that's China. And in the lower tier universities, it does seem, well, it is greater numbers of international postgraduates, Nigerian and Indian. And I'll reiterate on this slide, micro-location matters in most locations. And for us, and I guess for a lot of people on this webinar, 10 minutes maximum walk. Anything over that, we wouldn't want it. And you really need to be as close as possible. And when markets aren't so good, it feels like everything's good at the moment, but they're not. Some things are a bit tougher. You do need more creativity in letting. It is harder sometimes, and there's more cashbacks, there's more incentives, there's more feet on the ground to try, there's more ambassadors, etc. And generally speaking, less remote management. So you're there, you're sending people in, they out there, and we can see there's a food outlet related to us, but we just want to bring people together. It's where the markets aren't as good and you want to provide a better service. Next slide, please, Richard.
Yep.
The future. And I've been saying to us, everyone in our office, we just got to power through to 2025. Notwithstanding the current choppiness. Interest rates might go up again, a smidgen. In our opinion, might be wrong. Interest rates will or likely to drop down back a bit in the next 12 months with a little bit more stability, barring any Trussonomics or anything like that. I promised not to mention that. Sorry, Richard. Back in September 2022, when energy prices were going through the roof and we're all sat there with head in, what the hell's happening? We've already agreed our rents. We're getting hammered. We haven't done enough deals to protect ourselves, to hedge ourselves. For 1 millisecond, and it was a millisecond, I thought, well, actually, for our forward letting, shall we go exclusive? And then I came back to my senses and I thought, well, no, we're in the student market. It's an all-inclusive. Why are we going backwards? And it is a hospitality business. And it's like going into a hotel and paying 100 quid for your room and then checking out and say, well, actually, you use quite a lot of electricity or you lose a lot of heat. There's another £30 on top of that. It's not like that. You set your rents, you hold by them. In my opinion, which some people on this webinar may strongly disagree, we are in an all-inclusive model, and that's what the students expect, and that's what we should give. I know driving into work today, energy prices are coming down. We have seen that downward trajectory. They're still high though. They're still a hell of a lot higher than they were 2 years ago. So don't think that that's going away. It's still, we are expected and factoring into our rents more utility usage, but clearly more controls on the usage, which goes back to the inclusive model. You've got to have controls and sensible controls that restrict usage. Inflationary pressures, I don't think they're going away. Labor shortages, magically, that's not going to go away over the next 2-3 years. How is it? And affordability, that's a real issue. And are more students in some locations commuting to university? I think they are. And I think that's a real shame. And I would say that because they don't want to live with me. But I think it's a real shame for them. They're not having the rite of passage that I have when I was booted out of home and went to university and then never came back. I would hate for my children, growing up now, to have gone to the university in the town that I live in, because I don't think that's that step, and I don't think it's productive for the country. So that is an issue. Increased compliance. I'd like, this probably gin what I'm about to say now, but there will be people on this webinar who will agree with what I'm just saying. I'm replacing fire doors with fire doors, and that is really frustrating and expensive. But there are things happening where you get a license, you've got to replace that. It's a fire door. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. And then we replace it. It's an interesting market with a lot of frustrations. Unhelpful legislation. There have been a lot of things, and one I saw from StuRents very helpful on the Renters Act, but Renters Reform Act. We don't know the detail. It really does need to exclude student accommodation in parts of it. And there was another thing that's annoying me massively. I know, and the lowest figure I've seen for the contribution from international students in a year is 37.4 billion to the UK economy. That's the lower figure. I've also seen figures above 40 million. That's a big number for UK PLC. That's absolutely fantastic. I would like to see more welcoming talk and chat from the current Home Secretary. Again, I promise not to mention her name unless she's on the webinar, Richard. I don't know if you've invited Suella. Incredibly, I've been invited to go and do a question and answer in Parliament. I doubt if she'll be there, but I'd love you to be there, Suella, if you're on the webinar, just for a little chat, because I just think you should be a little bit more welcoming and less of the populist rhetoric, which bears no sense for a country moving forward and a business moving forward, and the amount of contribution. I mean, if we're talking at the lower end of the figures, 37.4 billion to the UK economy. And that's not just the UK economy in London, that's the UK economy whole throughout, even the Northeast, even in areas that I've got accommodation. That is a real benefit. I also put here geopolitical influence. I mean, there might be some turbulence in Asia, and that might affect high-end PBSA. Don't know. None of us know on that, and it's not something I really know enough about. So I know we've got some questions, so I'm going to conclude. And I wrote this little bit down, so I didn't mess it up, but I probably will mess it up. Rents are going up from a landlord's perspective. Occupancy is pretty high amongst us all, pretty much full. And there's no evidence. I'm not seeing evidence of yields where I'm seeing no evidence that prices are going down for our assets. In fact, if you look at the rents have gone up and the yields have stayed the same, so you could argue that our asset value has gone up. So in all of that, I should have a massive smile on my face. But really, it doesn't feel that good at the moment. And it doesn't feel that good because there's so much uncertainty. And that's not good for the industry. It's not good for us. I want stability. I want a boring year. And I'm not getting that. And if we have a stability, we can carry on growing and improving the sector that we all work in and that we all love. And that's my small 10 minutes of presentation. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Always interesting to hear your views, as always, and I appreciate that. Conscious of time, we've probably got 10 minutes or so left. I'll just stop the sharing and then we'll go through some of the questions that we can. Again, conscious of time, so we'll try and squeeze in as many as we can, but I don't think we're going to get around to all of them. On that particular point you just mentioned about rental growth, so the first one that's come in was essentially saying current year has seen significant increases in rental income. How sustainable is this given economic headwinds and potential affordability issues? I'm happy to start and then perhaps we'll go around the panelists and take it from there. So yeah, it's a very good question, and I think it's something we are all very much aware of. Obviously, as we saw in some of the data we're seeing so far, it doesn't seem to be deterring students. I think, in personal opinion, I think if you want to go to university, there's always going to be a breaking point, obviously, where it's not affordable, but that desire to go is going to remain strong. And then again, it's going to depend on the individual demographics. Again, as we've seen, Chinese students typically going to have higher price points and therefore potentially less price sensitive. But certainly going forward, as we see more and more demand from UK students, it's increasingly going to be an issue. And I think bringing that back to what Richard said earlier as well, again, if supply growth is not there, and if there's various factors that are limiting that, rents are just going to keep going up if demand continues to rise. And I think what is going to be a very interesting trend is whether we start to see, again, on Richard's point, students having to commute further because the supply is just simply not in the locations they need it to be in. And that's going to either push rents up continuously, or you're going to get students that are perhaps not facing as high rents, but less desirable accommodation, not in particularly good locations. So again, it's not particularly attractive from a UK perspective. Ben, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this, whether you're seeing more discussions around affordability from students, and if that's, I presume it's increasingly being questioned from those that are applying. Oh, I think you're on mute.
I thought we all learned how to do that by now.
There's always one time.
There's always one, and it had to be me, didn't it? On a webinar in front of hundreds of people. So different students have different financial sensitivities. So your more financially sensitive student tends to be your more disadvantaged student. That's quite obvious. They tend to be your more mature students as well, and they also tend to be also more economically influenced. What we're seeing through cost of living is, so we haven't, it's really hard for UCAS to talk about number of applicants in relation to cost of living, because whilst our numbers are remaining strong, in reality, we're probably the third step on that journey. We don't know how many people we've lost in relation to actually, I just can't afford it, I'm not going to consider it. So different students have different senses of affordability. And we are seeing some students become much more financially alert. So more people thinking about part-time jobs, people really scaling back what that social life will look like. And we are hearing murmurings of that live at home. So Richard made a point about seeing more commuter students. So around 1 in 3 students who studied in higher education lives at home. For your 18-year-old cohort, it's 1 in 4. But where I think there's a pressure point, and where I think I will go on to into, because I think there's a role for accommodation here, it's half of the most disadvantaged students live at home. Now, my worry is in the journey to 1 million, you create a more competitive environment, and it's you see, supply and demand, etc., impacting on prices. Just in the same way that in higher education, you could see disadvantaged students squeezed out from study, there is a risk around accommodation. So I would be asking people on the call to think about what is the role in accommodation in supporting widening access and participation. Because if we look at that projection in the journey to 1 million, we think the application rate for different students, so the proportion of groups, we think about 1 in 3 students from the most disadvantaged backgrounds will apply to higher education come 2030, but we also think 2 in 3 from the most advantaged backgrounds will apply. So we are predicting that that sort of difference in participation will increase, and accommodation is a key consideration. You also look at some of the individual needs of certain groups. So we've released reports looking at students with mental health challenges, disabled students, care experience students, LGBT students. All of them rank accommodation as an absolute key factor in terms of their decision making, because they have individual needs, because they have individual desires, and they look for that in their accommodation. So I think there's a big role there for accommodation in sort of mitigating some of the risks in relation to certain groups of students being squeezed out.
Yeah. And Richard, are you seeing, I guess, more, I don't know if you're seeing it at all, students coming to you and literally saying we cannot afford the rent, or is that not something you're seeing at the moment?
I'm seeing a little bit more pressure. Generally, we tend to be a bit lower in rental, and we tend to fill quite quickly. But certainly on the postgraduate front, very few can afford to live with us, and it's it's a difficult one to solve. I do see a flattening of the curve of rents increasing a little bit, location specific. Although having said that, in some locations, studios don't seem to have an upper level of rent. In certain, you can just keep on going higher and higher, but that's a rarefied market. Yeah, I see a flattening of the curve slightly, but if supply is restricted, as you rightly say.
Yeah, I think for me, it comes down to volume, right? I mean, even if there is going to be a proportion that cannot afford it because rents are continuing to rise, if the number of more affluent students continues to go up or is large enough, then that's just going to keep driving upwards. So yeah, one to definitely keep a close eye on. I know you've touched on it already. There's a couple of questions both around regulation and obviously renters reform bill recently released. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. One particular question around, do you see the HMO sector suffering as a result of regulatory changes? I think, again, it's been touched on. The bill that was released recently, I think, was less clear than the actual original government white paper, which has helped nobody. Interestingly, there was a House of Commons report in response to that original white paper, and somewhat positively, that report actually did recommend all of student is exempt, which seems pretty positive. But there has been from what I have seen, no government response to those recommendations. So still a lot of uncertainty. So yeah, I think if I had to get the crystal ball out, I would probably forecast there's going to be some kind of amendment or addendum to the current bill, and that will then incorporate student somehow. But again, we just don't know, and that I think is the big problem at the moment. I'm not sure, Rich, if you have anything to add to that. That's my kind of takeaway from what we're kind of hearing and seeing at the moment.
I've had no other feedback other than from yourself, and it would be catastrophic to some people, and for some, how it settles down, I'm not sure. But we did the devil. We need the detail.
Yeah. I think it's one of those that there's potentially a lot of unintended consequences, and I think the government's starting to potentially wake up to those. Question around, I guess, partnerships. I know it was mentioned in terms of joined up thinking. I think, Richard, you already said no, but I don't know, Ben, are you seeing any increased kind of partnerships or dialogue between particularly universities and accommodation providers? Is that something that's being tabled?
I